when a trembling elderly woman standing outside a small Virginia church sobbed that her beloved dog had run away. President Trump, who had just finished greeting supporters, stopped in his tracks with a resolve no one expected to see in the middle of such a busy day. He had been on his way back to the waiting motorcade, staffers subtly nudging him to move along, but something about the woman's raw plea melted the formality right off his face. She wore a worn-out cardigan, and her eyes brimmed with the kind of heartbreak only a true animal lover would recognize. As she explained, between heavy breaths, that her dog Sugar had bolted from the yard just before dawn, and that she had been searching all day with no luck, President Trump placed a hand on her shoulder and quietly promised to do everything he could to help. His security detail exchanged glances, not quite sure what to make of this impromptu vow, but he signaled for them to stand down. In that moment, the demands of politics and schedules faded behind an unexpected surge of compassion for a stranger's loss. She introduced herself as Mrs. Daniels, known around those parts for her unwavering devotion to Sugar. Neighbors said she baked treats on Sundays, not just for the church bake sale, but also for her dog, whom she doted on like a grandchild. When President Trump noticed her trembling hands, he asked one of his aides for a blanket or coat to drape around her shoulders, because the early autumn wind was picking up and there was a chill in the air. She declined at first, too focused on her missing companion, but the aide insisted, gently placing the coat over her. President Trump knelt beside her, the camera flashes momentarily forgotten, and asked for details. Where was Sugar last seen? What color was her coat? Did she have a collar? How old was she? Mrs. Daniels answered through tears, explaining that Sugar was a small beagle, nearly 10 years old, wearing a red collar with a tiny American flag tag. President Trump took out his phone and instructed a nearby staff member to contact local authorities, requesting a search effort. The staffer hesitated, unsure if it was appropriate to mobilize official resources for a lost dog, but President Trump's tone left no room for argument. "Get the local police on the line," he said, "and let them know I'm requesting their help." Meanwhile, curious onlookers began to gather, forming a semicircle around the odd scene. A distraught older woman, the President of the United States with a protective arm around her, and Secret Service agents scanning the perimeter as if preparing for a more conventional threat. The tension, though, wasn't about politics or security, but about finding a creature who meant the world to this grieving soul. The woman, Mrs. Daniels, was beside herself with worry. She explained that Sugar was her only companion since her husband passed away, and the thought of losing her dog too weighed on her like a heavy burden. The local police chief arrived soon after in a patrol car, lights flashing but no siren, uncertain why he had been summoned so abruptly. When he stepped out, President Trump walked straight to him, explaining the situation: a missing dog, an elderly woman who was alone and afraid, and a president who refused to let her despair go unanswered. The police chief blinked in surprise, then nodded with respect. Though he wasn't used to receiving direct orders from the nation's leader about an animal search, there was something undeniably moving about the request. He agreed to coordinate a small team of officers and volunteers to canvass the area. President Trump asked if the local fire department might also be willing to help, and the chief promised to check. Mrs. Daniels, clutching the edge of the president's coat, whispered her gratitude, seeming almost in disbelief at how swiftly everything was happening. In the blink of an eye, the small church parking lot turned into a makeshift command post. A few local reporters who had initially come to cover President Trump's appearance began broadcasting live updates about the unusual search. People at home saw the feeds and recognized Mrs. Daniels, knowing how dear that dog was to her. Soon, a wave of townspeople hopped into their trucks and cars to help look for Sugar, driving slowly along back roads, shining flashlights into bushes and ditches, calling out the dog's name. Even those who had never met Mrs. Daniels felt a surge of neighborly duty, reminded of that old American spirit of helping a friend in need. Some believed that maybe, just maybe, their efforts carried a spark of divine guidance. After all, it was no coincidence that the president had stopped at this particular church on this particular day, or so they said. For Mrs. Daniels, the sudden support felt like a miracle. She'd been praying all morning, clutching her well-worn Bible, asking God to bring Sugar home safely. Now she found herself in the center of an unlikely rescue operation, spearheaded by the most powerful man in the nation. President Trump, for his part, felt an unexpected softness in his heart. It wasn't as though he had never been kind before, but this moment touched him differently. Maybe it was the sight of Mrs. Daniels's trembling lip, or maybe it was the memory of how he had felt the first time he encountered an older relative in tears. Whatever it was, it made him determined not to leave until something concrete was done. He directed staff members to hand out water bottles to volunteers, told local businesses to keep an eye out for a small beagle, and personally comforted Mrs. Daniels by gently rubbing her back, assuring her they would find Sugar. People posted updates on social media with pictures of Sugar's old photos that Mrs. Daniels had on her phone, describing the red collar and the tiny flag tag. The search swelled as the news spread. The president was on a mission to find a missing dog, and the entire community was rallying behind him. Some joked that if the president could tackle big national issues, he could certainly locate one lost beagle. Others felt stirred by a sense of patriotic unity, as if they were all participants in a modern-day demonstration of compassion and faith. Hours passed, and the day turned golden as the sun began to dip toward the horizon. The search teams fanned out across fields and neighborhood streets, whistling and calling the dog's name. President Trump stayed in the church parking lot, occasionally pacing or taking calls, but mostly remaining by Mrs. Daniels's side. He noticed she was exhausted, her voice raspy from calling out Sugar's name earlier, so he insisted she rest inside the church, where a few kind-hearted folks had prepared tea. Though Mrs. Daniels was reluctant, she eventually allowed herself to sit down for a moment on a pew, her gaze flicking worriedly between the heavy church doors and the president's face. At one point, a volunteer rushed in with a false alarm, saying he'd spotted a small white dog near the edge of the woods, but it turned out to be someone else's pet. Disappointment rippled through the group, but President Trump urged them not to lose hope. He recalled how in tough times, Americans always found a way to persevere, be it in war, in disaster relief, or in personal trials. The spirit of can-do grit was embedded in the nation's DNA, and no missing dog was going to best them if they kept their faith strong. Some local folks nodded, feeling an uplifting sense of solidarity they hadn't felt in years. It reminded them of stories their grandparents told, of communities pulling together during hard times, trusting in God's guiding hand. Meanwhile, the local police chief radioed in updates, a handful of sightings, none confirmed as Sugar, and a lot of well-meaning confusion. He apologized to President Trump if this was taking too long, but President Trump waved off the apology. "We'll stay until we find her," he said firmly. That statement echoed through the old wooden walls, stirring something in Mrs. Daniels's chest, fueling her with new determination. She folded her hands, bowing her head in a silent prayer, whispering words of thanks to the Almighty for sending her such help in her darkest hour. By nightfall, the air had turned crisp and cool, and volunteers began to wonder if they'd have to resume the search in the morning. Nobody wanted to give up, but flashlights could only do so much. President Trump stepped outside, scanning the parking lot where cars were parked haphazardly, volunteers milling about with tired expressions. He was on the verge of telling everyone to rest for a few hours when a frantic bark cut through the quiet. At first, people froze, unsure if they had really heard it. Then another bark echoed from a far corner near a line of scraggly bushes behind the church. One of the Secret Service agents, half concealed in the shadows, raised a hand to call attention. President Trump hurried over, heart pounding, and Mrs. Daniels came stumbling out of the church door, tears already forming in her eyes. There, trembling and dirty, was Sugar, her fur matted with leaves and mud, her collar askew, but unmistakably the same little beagle in the phone pictures. She took one look at the crowd and darted backward, startled by the sudden rush of people. President Trump quickly motioned for everyone to stand still. Mrs. Daniels, tears streaming, inched forward, whispering Sugar's name in the softest voice. The dog hesitated, ears perked, uncertain eyes scanning the faces. Then, recognizing her owner's voice, Sugar bolted forward, leaping into Mrs. Daniels' outstretched arms. The old woman nearly collapsed from relief, sobbing uncontrollably as she held the trembling dog to her chest. The crowd erupted in cheers, applause, and emotional shouts. The tension that had built all day vanished in a wave of pure joy. Mrs. Daniels sank to her knees on the damp grass, hugging Sugar while President Trump crouched beside her, a hand lightly resting on the woman's shoulder. One volunteer flicked on a flashlight, illuminating the tearful reunion. People lifted their phones to snap pictures, capturing the moment of victory that felt almost cinematic in its relief. Sugar licked her owner's cheeks, wagging her tail wildly, as if apologizing for the scare she had caused. Mrs. Daniels looked up at President Trump, her face streaked with tears and her voice shaking, and thanked him repeatedly, calling him an answer to her prayers. He responded with a soft-spoken, "I'm just glad we found her. You're not alone here." Someone shouted, "God bless America," from the back, and the crowd roared in agreement, not in a pompous or forced way, but in a heartfelt release of emotion. It felt like the kind of moment that reminded everyone of what it meant to be part of a caring nation, one where even the president could stop everything to help a single person in need. Mrs. Daniels, still on her knees, gazed at the nighttime sky. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, holding Sugar close, "and thank you, President Trump." In the church's dim light, the combination of patriotism and faith intertwined like a living symbol of the nation's core values: unity, compassion, and the conviction that no problem is too small or too large when people come together in goodwill. Even the camera crew from a local news station, which had been rolling this entire time, found themselves weeping. They lowered their lenses, feeling that the raw humanity of the moment outweighed any broadcast angle. Meanwhile, the police chief wiped his brow, relieved that the day had ended on such a triumphant note. President Trump shook his hand and thanked him for the quick mobilization, and the chief grinned, admitting he'd never forget this search operation. Mrs. Daniels slowly got to her feet, leaning on President Trump for support. Sugar was still pressed to her chest, tail wagging nonstop. The old woman looked as though a massive weight had lifted from her shoulders. She apologized for causing such a fuss, but President Trump waved it off. "You have nothing to be sorry about," he said. "We stand together, and you needed help. That's enough." The small circle of bystanders broke into fresh applause, some patting Mrs. Daniels gently on the back, others stepping forward to offer President Trump heartfelt gratitude for caring about something that many might have dismissed as trivial. As the adrenaline subsided, it became clear that Mrs. Daniels and Sugar needed a warm meal and a quiet place to rest. The pastor of the church offered them a corner in the fellowship hall, and someone from the local diner hurried over with a pot of soup. President Trump, mindful of protocol, accepted the congregation's invitation to step inside and share a moment of fellowship before he had to continue his itinerary. The scene that followed was modest, yet profound. A simple meal, a hush of humble voices praising God for bringing the dog home, and a sense of reverence that an entire community had just witnessed a rare display of kindness from the highest office in the land. While folks prepared to depart, President Trump gently patted Sugar's head, remarking that the dog looked a lot happier and safer now. Mrs. Daniels laughed through her tears, finally able to smile without fear, grateful beyond words. She hugged him as he stood to leave, her small frame dwarfed by his, yet the warmth in that embrace moved everyone around them. In that exchange, the barriers between public figure and ordinary citizen vanished. There was just gratitude, and there was faith, both rooted in the shared relief that good deeds still happened. Eventually, President Trump stepped outside, the crisp air reminding him that time was passing and responsibilities awaited. His motorcade, which had been patiently parked since the search began, was ready to roll. Cameras from national networks had arrived by then, capturing the final moments of the reunion. However, President Trump signaled he would not make a big speech. Instead, he simply wished Mrs. Daniels well, told her to take Sugar to a vet checkup just in case, and reiterated that if she needed anything else, she shouldn't hesitate to reach out. The old woman's eyes shone with renewed hope. She clutched her Bible with one hand, Sugar in the other, repeating how grateful she was, how she would pray for him every night. As the motorcade pulled away, the crowd parted to let the vehicles through, many waving small flags or cell phones in the air. A few cried out words of thanks. Others simply stood in respectful silence. Mrs. Daniels watched from the steps of the church, Sugar bundled in her arms, feeling the lingering warmth of a community that had joined forces under the guidance of the president. She knew that no matter where politics went from here, she would always hold this day in her heart as proof that neighborly love, guided by faith and compassion, could still triumph when it mattered most. The pastor beside her lowered his head in a quiet prayer of thanks, and those around him did the same. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of a dog's bark drifted through the air, a gentle reminder that life, in all its fragility, was also full of tender mercies. In the following days, the story spread far and wide, igniting debates and discussions about the role of leadership, the depth of community bonds, and the significance of trusting in God's providence for even the smallest of creatures. National news outlets played footage of the tearful reunion, and across social media, images of Mrs. Daniels hugging President Trump and cradling Sugar captured hearts. Many praised the show of unity, while a few remained skeptical, but even those with hardened opinions admitted there was something genuine in the way President Trump had dropped everything to comfort a grieving stranger. Mrs. Daniels, for her part, was inundated with well wishes and visits from neighbors she never knew she had. They brought dog biscuits, prayer cards, and offers of free grooming services for Sugar. She accepted all these kindnesses with humility, always pointing back to that single moment of shared faith in the church parking lot. Though President Trump returned to the business of running the country, the memory of this day stayed with him. Late one evening, after the swirl of meetings and decisions, he closed his eyes and recalled the sight of Mrs. Daniels kneeling in the grass, Sugar running into her arms, the sense that everything else paused for a moment as relief washed over them. It reminded him that politics was not just about negotiations and speeches, but about the small acts of humanity that proved America was more than just a place. It was a community bound by hope. He thought about how the simplest gesture, responding to a plea for help, could reaffirm the bonds that tied people together, bonds that transcended backgrounds, beliefs, and social standing. Sometimes, when staff members teased him about the day he became the dog finder-in-chief, he would grin and say, "It was worth every minute." And in those words lay a deeper truth. If leading meant caring, even for one old woman's broken heart, then his position truly served its purpose. Behind the scenes, aides noticed he seemed a little kinder, a bit more patient, especially when presented with the personal stories of everyday Americans. Nobody could prove it was a direct result of the dog search, but a few staffers were convinced that witnessing such a raw display of gratitude and faith had touched him more than any poll number or campaign rally ever could. Months later, Mrs. Daniels sent a handwritten letter to the White House updating President Trump that Sugar was doing well. She included a photo of them both, standing proudly in front of her little house, a waving American flag in the background. She wrote that every morning she thanked God for having mercy on her that day, for leading her to cross paths with the president outside the church, and for moving his heart to compassion. The letter closed with a promise. "I will never forget the moment you took time out of your day to find a lost dog for an old woman. May God bless you always." It was signed simply, Mrs. Ellen Daniels and Sugar. When the letter arrived, President Trump read it quietly, nodding at each line, a faint smile creasing his face. He placed it in a folder marked Personal Correspondence, intending to keep it safe. Then he called over the same staffer who had helped coordinate the search effort and showed him the photo. The staffer, too, remembered that day with warmth, and they shared a moment of reflective silence. "This is why we do what we do," President Trump said softly, tucking the letter away. He didn't elaborate, but the staffer understood. While the tasks of governance often revolved around large-scale issues, sometimes the true essence of leadership appeared in tiny acts of empathy that reminded everyone of their shared humanity. Every so often, President Trump would inquire about Mrs. Daniels, asking if anyone had heard how she was doing or if Sugar was still healthy. He even considered sending a small gift basket on the dog's next birthday, though it was unclear exactly when that was. Whether he followed through or not, the sentiment remained. Once you step into someone's life at their most vulnerable moment, you carry a piece of their story with you, and in that carrying, you find renewed purpose. Word of this event spread into a local legend around the town, passed along in church gatherings and family dinners. People said that if President Trump could drop everything to look for one lost beagle, then surely they could help each other out when it mattered. They repeated the story to children in Sunday school, using it as a lesson about empathy and faith. They pointed to the place in the grass where sugar had reappeared, telling newcomers that's where a small miracle happened, right under the watchful eyes of God and the American spirit. Eventually, life returned to normal, but for Mrs. Daniels and Sugar, normal now came with a deeper sense of security. She stopped fearing that no one would care if something happened to her or her dog. She had experienced firsthand how a community could band together, sparked by a leader who chose compassion over protocol. And in her nightly prayers, she mentioned Trump by name, asking God to guide him as he guided the nation, remembering that leaders were people too, capable of both grand gestures and genuine kindness. Long after the last news clip aired and the last headline faded, the memory of that day remained a quiet testament to the power of a single act of generosity. There was no large-scale policy attached, no sweeping executive order, just one old woman, one missing beagle, and a president who refused to ignore her tears. It became a story people told when they needed a reminder that hope was not just a word, but an active choice, a choice that could manifest in the simplest of deeds. Whether they believed in fate or divine intervention, they all agreed that something extraordinary had taken place in that modest Virginia churchyard, and that for one shining moment, everyone saw how faith, patriotism, and compassion could unite to restore what was lost. And so Mrs. Daniels and Sugar continued their lives in quiet contentment, with the old beagle dozing on the porch under the afternoon sun, and the sound of distant church bells ringing through the wind. Sometimes, when a neighbor passed by, they would wave hello and ask how Sugar was doing, and Mrs. Daniels would smile, recalling that night she feared her dog might be gone forever, only to have a miracle unfold before her eyes. She would fondly repeat the words she uttered to President Trump that day, the words that summed up her entire gratitude. "Thank you for finding my best friend, and thank God for sending you my way." And in that simple refrain lived the essence of an America where no soul, human or animal, was overlooked if people had the heart to care. A reminder, we're giving away a signed copy of the Bible from President Donald Trump. This is your chance to own a piece of history, as there will only be one lucky winner. Here is what you have to do. Like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment saying, "God is with us." Help spread the word and share this with your friends. God bless you all, and good luck.